Welcome to the one and only podcast on disproportionate representation of African Americans in special education. Special education is a system that allows people with mental and physical disabilities to be taught in different ways and settings. This system is a way for students who wouldn't do well in a regular classroom to still learn and interact with students in a school setting. However, disproportionate representation causes problems for the system. Disproportionate representation occurs when a portion of the population, in this case African Americans, has a significantly higher or lower percentage of people in a certain group, in this case, the special education group. In the case of African Americans in special education, they're only 20% of the United States population, but they represent 28% of all students in special education. In an ideal world, these percentages would be close to one another, indicating that African Americans are not disproportionately represented in special education. However, this is not the case. African Americans have about 10% more students in special education than general education overall. But why are African Americans so overly represented in special education? To help answer this question, here is Dr. Katelyn Zirkus, my introduction to special education teacher, who has a PhD in special education and has worked in the field for many years. Woo! Woo! So, I just have some questions for you.
No problem.
First, what does the disproportionate representation of minorities, such as African Americans and indigenous people, imply about the special education program?
It implies a lot. I think that's a loaded question. We talk about it a lot in the class that we have together. It speaks to the assessment process a lot and how we diagnose kids and what specific cultural groups get those labels. So I think there's major flaws in how we not only assess, but how we diagnose. I guess if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How would you say the diagnosis process affects that? Like, I would think it's supposed to just be as objective as possible.
Right. Yeah, we've unfortunately classified, like we talk about in class, classified certain racial groups as having certain labels. And we've carried that probably for the last few decades, and research still shows that we're still doing it. So unfortunately, it's still happening. We haven't figured out, or maybe we haven't prepared teachers enough to look out or spot those things when they are assessing, or even school psychologists or doctors even. So it's a pretty broad issue, I guess.
Yeah. It just seems really weird that that's happening just because of like cultural biases and stuff.
Yeah, you would think that we would, now in 2021, you would think that things have shifted, but we're still seeing the numbers climb for African American boys. We're still seeing it for indigenous people, for Native Americans. So we're still seeing certain categories assigned with certain racial groups, unfortunately. So pretty sad stuff.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate.
Not to cut this part of the conversation off.
No problem.
How has this disproportionate representation affected you as a special education teacher?
When I was a teacher, I have a big justice thing, obviously. I don't think I'd be in this position if I didn't. But I would almost have those specific kids advocate more for themselves and make sure they had the self-determination skills more so, or even the guardians that were around them able to speak for that kid. I think it speaks to advocacy and us kind of calling the system out and making the system take a second look at the diagnoses and at, you know what I mean, what's in our schools and what's in our self-contained classrooms. So, and just stopping and paying attention to the details and going, hang on a second, is this a really bad kid or do we label them wrong? So just taking a second look at what we're doing, I think is really important. And just kind of slowing down. So
Definitely. Yeah. Do you think it's a really big problem, or is it not like
it's massive.
That bad?
It's massive. I think I was going to add to the last part. We couple trauma, right? Trauma gets mixed into these labels specifically with kids with emotional behavior disorders, and we classify them to a specific racial group, to a specific gender class, and that's who gets that label, when really if we were treating the trauma in the whole child like we talked about in class, we probably could get rid of a lot of those statistics. So it's just paying attention, honestly. I really think so. But it's a big problem, to answer your question. Massive to me.
Yeah.
It's big.
And
it's systemic.
I know through a lot of my research, I was reading that like these kids could be taking away spots in special education programs from other kids who might need it way more.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
I couldn't agree with you more, yeah.
I find that, though, a kind of gray area, since you don't want to not treat a kid even if they're less severe than another kid.
True. Yeah, it can be, right? The diagnoses are depending on, right, if you're treating the whole kid, you might be able to fit right in that gray area and find a balance between treatment and education, as opposed to just a pipeline, specifically with kids with EBD, right to the juvenile justice system, or right to, a label, if you will. So if you treat it on the front end, I mean, to your point, and treat them and give them the education that they need, we may not even need to deal with the stats and the disproportionality on the back end. So, yeah, we just gotta slow down, honestly. So, yeah. Good point, though.
Taking a better look at them.
Yeah, exactly. The whole kid. Exactly. And what are their needs? What are they, just taking a whole kid as opposed to just a snapshot. So, yeah, I'm with you.
Who do you think is more affected by the disproportionate representation, the students or the system as a whole?
Oh, the student, hands down. The student and their family, hands down.
Yeah.
Yeah. The minute they get entered in, yeah, hands down, from what I've seen from my perspective. They stay in it. It's generational, typically. So if his brother, got this label, it's pretty high likely that the next generation is going to get the next, same labels. So it just continues. It takes somebody to come in there and break it up, unfortunately. So, yeah, I would definitely say the kid. Definitely.
And do you think it's like the negative label or just trying to figure out the right words?
I know, yeah. It's tough. I think it starts with the label, and if you think of your question, let me know. It starts with the label, as for example, right, I have EBD in my head, so emotional behavior disorders. It starts with the label, and that kind of kicks it off, right? So if they have bad behavior in elementary school, and they get that label, we just pick up speed. So by the time I get them in high school, they are in and out of juvenile justice. They have a parole officer, right? They have a record. So then the disproportionality is right there for everybody to see by the time they're in high school. It just kind of picks up speed. If we were to treat it, right, treat the trauma and get some supports in the home in elementary school, we may be able to take off that label and not have them, among all these different systems. So, at least in my opinion. But I think the label, once a school psych or doctor gives them, you have an emotional behavior disorder, or, right, kind of kicks it off, or autism. But, yeah.
And, kind of with my own mindset, do you think it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point?
I completely agree with you, yeah. I think so. I mean, I think that bad kid, quote unquote, air quotes, stays a bad kid until they get out of the public education system, because nobody will, enough teachers kind of just reinforce that label instead of taking it off, we reinforce it. So a bad kid stays a bad kid. So I would 100% agree with you. Sadly. specifically with EBD. I'm not going to speak on other disability categories because I think they have probably the most significant disproportionality rates out there.
Yeah.
And I've seen it with my own eyes. So, yeah, African American, and I would also say Latino. I would say both. I've seen both. That was the population that I had in my classrooms at day treatments. So,
do you think, like, kind of going back to how it's generational, do you think, like, the people diagnosing them are taking into account that other people in their family have had these disorders and, like, genetics?
It actually makes it easier for the diagnostician in my head, right? So, right with what I do now, if one of the siblings has autism, well, then the other one has to have it. And that's not always true, right?
Yeah.
If there's, I see it more when there's more kids in the home. So if there's 9 kids in the home, well, 5 out of the 9 have to have autism. But it's not true. So, I mean, that label, that first part, I understand we need services, right? But giving them the right supports. The family may need family supports as opposed to the diagnosing of autism or EBD, right? EBD, we need supports for trauma. We don't really need the label, we need the supports to break the cycle, if that makes any sense. We need somebody to really get in there and get their hands dirty.
Yeah.
As opposed to just labeling and kind of deductively plugging in services and then backing off. So, if that makes any sense, yeah. At least from my perspective, that's what I've seen in California and here. So, and I would say probably Nevada too. We slot in services pretty quickly as opposed to figuring out the core issue and working out. Very much like person-centered planning. So, but yeah, very good question. That was a really good question.
I think that's all I have. I might talk to you later.
No,
just
absolutely.
Off of this.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well. Woo! Woo! A potential set of causes for this disproportionate representation are the implicit biases that many people hold and our overall lack of cultural understanding of minority groups. This leads to their placement in the groups for quote-unquote different kids, and this includes special education. And as Katelyn Zirkus mentioned, it can also include juvenile justice systems and being expelled from school. Many famous philosophers, including Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, and Kierkegaard, said that we are known and judged by the decisions we make and how we make them. This type of thinking is an important aspect of ontological rhetoric. In this context, the teacher's decisions to refer many African American children into this special education program reveals their implicit biases and a lack of cultural understanding of the differences between them and the children. This results in many teachers believing that African American students have speech or language delays when it's really just a difference in speech patterns. Another important aspect to this issue is teachers and school systems' values. Axiological rhetoric, or rhetoric that reveals one's values, is used by the school system to show their values of compliance and the importance of standardized education. However, these values contribute to the disproportionate representation of African Americans and other minorities. A change to these values into those such as cultivation of creativity and individualized or dynamic education would help alleviate this issue and improve the education system for all. Finally, there's epistemological rhetoric. This type of rhetoric is extremely important in how we learn and distribute knowledge. In school, we are taught with 2 main styles: visual presentations and auditory lectures. Sometimes teachers will also implement kinesthetic learning with pattern blocks or projects. However, many students, especially those in special education, do not learn in these few ways. Despite what many people believe, different students have a huge number of different learning styles, ranging far beyond what the current education system promotes. If the school system's epistemological rhetoric could change to that of many teaching styles to include the many different types of learners, students who are higher functioning in their respective disability categories and those in the special education system could be put back into the general education system and learn just as well as their quote-unquote normal peers. This would allow them to learn in the way that they need to, and it would allow them to be reintegrated with the general education students, a goal that the special education system has been attempting to accomplish ever since its inception. All in all, African American students are disproportionately represented in special education. This is because of teachers' implicit biases and overall lack of cultural understanding of minority groups. This is revealed through the schools' and teachers' decisions, their ontological rhetoric. Additionally, schools' axiological rhetoric shows that schools value compliance and standardization for all students, but along with more mild disabilities, minority students do not always fit this mold, and it causes them to be placed in special education and other systems. However, while the current epistemological rhetoric of schools only allows for visual and auditory learners, an expansion of teaching methods will allow more students to learn effectively and prevent many students from being wrongfully placed in special education classrooms. If the school system can change how it views its students, what it expects from those students, and how it teaches those students, schools can slow and maybe even stop the overrepresentation of minorities such as African Americans in special education. Thank you for listening.